So yeah, really excited to share today. So my topic today is our calling, walking forward in faith in uncertainty, and just really felt like it was a really relevant topic as a lot of us are in transition. A lot of us have gone through seasons of uncertainty or potentially facing it currently. So I just really felt like this was something that hopefully will bless all of us today. The topic and the passage I'll be speaking on today is on Joshua, not because of my son, whose name is Joshua, but actually because of the character in the Bible who he is named after. And he is, in my opinion, one of the best leaders that we see in the Old Testament. And his story really has resonated with me in my journey from China all the way back to the U.S. So just a bit of backstory, similar to Eden, actually. I grew up in the States, Christian home, went to Berkeley. After Berkeley, went to Apple, as he said. Was actually only supposed to be at Apple for a 2-year stint doing rotations. They forced me to go to China, so it was not something that I wanted to do. I was forced to go for a 3-month rotation, which became 6 months, which became 4 years. Crazy story, which I would love to share about more if you ever have a chance to hear. Met my husband there, actually met his parents first, separately through a completely separate occasion. And they didn't introduce me to their son. They didn't let me know that they had a son in Shanghai. And so I completely met the son on a completely separate occasion, which was insane. He was the first person I met in China. We fell in love within 6 months, got married about a few years later, and then we both personally realized we have a calling to China, individually and then collectively. Following that, Apple decided we both applied to business school for a sabbatical in the US to train up to go back to China eventually. We actually my husband only applied to one school. We only could agree on one business school, and that was Kellogg. We both applied, got in, and that was the only reason why we decided to go, was because we said, God, your confirmation is that we both get in, and we did. So we went to Kellogg the last 2 years, just graduated about a year and a half ago, and I joined. We both actually then applied to Nike, where we both got into Nike together, and Nike will be sending us back to China in the next year and a half. So it's been a whirlwind of a journey, and I will be talking a little bit more about intertwining my story and how it kind of resonates with Joshua's journey as well. So that's just a bit of background. So just a bit of context for those who I'm sure all of us do know about Joshua's story, but what I really want to talk about again is uncertainty and facing barriers and breaking through. And so today, the two major instances that Joshua was facing is he had just taken the mantle, right, from Moses, and he was now walking them supposedly into the promised land after 40 years of much suffering and wandering in the desert. And what's interesting, the two biggest barriers that they ended up facing was one, the crossing of the Jordan, and two, the city of Jericho. And both of these we'll talk about in depth today. But so you can imagine that I just want you guys to be able to put yourselves into Joshua's shoes today with me, as we think about how he's feeling, what he's thinking about as we walk through these passages. And so there's 5 major steps that we see Joshua go through as a leader, and I think these are some things that are very, very relevant to us as we face areas of uncertainty, and things that, for me personally, have just been just a framework that I have used over time and time again as I face transition. As you have noticed from my story, a lot of transition in my life. So first is being called. And I think that's something about being versus doing, and we'll go more into depth of what that means. Second, consecrate, consecration, sanctification. Third, cross, so not cross as in the cross, but actually crossing, taking a step, crossing over the river. Fourth would be circle, so choosing a place where you want God to show up, and so circling a place. And then finally, celebrating. And so we'll walk through each of these steps. And within each one of those buckets, I'm going to share about a personal story of how that kind of ties. And so we'll first start with called. So we're going to start in Joshua 3. It says, early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priest carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. So who here knows what is the Ark of the Covenant? What exactly is happening here? Does anyone know what it looks like? What's inside it? Ark of the Covenant.
The presence of what? Where there is a presence of what is it?
Thank you. Exactly. So the Ark of the Covenant is where the presence of God physically is, and that's where the Israelites would follow it. And so we see here, first off, the Israelites have never been this way before, and so I think similarly, God often calls us to places that we have never been, and I think He does that, one, to force us to take risks, two, to step out in faith, but also to kind of put us in a place where we have to trust, we have to depend on Him, and that's really something that we see in Joshua, where they're in a place where they're headed somewhere where they have never been before, and it is somewhere that Joshua, as a leader, is called to lead his people. And definitely, again, just want you guys to be thinking throughout this entire time of, like, are you in a place where you're called to lead a group of people into a place you have never been before? What does that feel like? What are you feeling? And it says you are to move out from your positions and follow it. And what I love about this section is that it says that it's a direct command to follow the Ark of the Covenant and to not leave their eyes off of it, meaning that where the presence of God goes, that's where you follow. And I think for me, I am someone who is very action-oriented. I like to do a lot of things. I like to get things done. I like to feel accomplished hitting the tasks off. But one thing that Joshua 3 has constantly challenged me in is it's not about me accomplishing things. I need to first, before I move, I often move too quickly. I move before God so often in my life. And this one just constantly reminds me, you have to first be called. You need to watch where the covenant of God is going, and then that's the only time you move. Otherwise, you wait. And I think it's really hard for go-getters, for people who are used to doing, as the first step is you're being, you're not doing. And that's something that I've had to continually work in my entire life. That's why I love that. They're not to move out until they're called to follow it. And also this whole idea of seeing the presence of God. Now, that's really interesting to me because nowadays we don't have the Ark of the Covenant. There's not like a Bible floating around where you're supposed to just kind of run after it nowadays, right? What does the presence of God look like for you to follow? What does that look like in your specific instance to follow, to see it, and to actually move? And in order to know which way to go. And are you following it that closely, or are you kind of just like, I get the gist of it, God, and now I'm just going to kind of follow it as a very high level piece, but versus this very detailed following that He's calling Joshua to and calling the Israelites to. And so one thing just to encourage is be encouraged that God knows that you have never been this way before, that He's calling you to follow the Ark of His Covenant, and then you will know which way to go. Just a really interesting story about my time in China. So again, as I said earlier, when I was at Apple, I did not want to go to China. I was forced to go, and only because I spoke Mandarin. I had spent a season of praying, though, when Apple had said, we're giving you an expat assignment, you're going. I'm like, okay. And so I spent a week fasting in prayer. Me and Matt actually took some time apart just so we could separately pray to make sure that this was a personal calling of mine. And as I was praying, something really, I think, miraculous happened as I was really seeking God versus just my own opinions, my own thoughts, and own distractions. My mom actually ended up came and visited me. This is kind of a crazy story. And she said, I don't know if you remember, but this is something that you and your best friend drew in 2006. That was like 10 years ago. And she's like, I brought it for you because I just wanted to. My mom's an amazing woman of faith. She's like, I brought it for you just to remind you of something. And so my friend drew this. Her name's Mimi. She drew it, and she drew ... When I went to the San Diego High School, Westview, ... She drew Cal Berkeley. So she drew Cal Berkeley, graduated from Cal Berkeley. And then I'm looking at this, and I'm like, what? She drew China, or what she could best draw. And then she had to write China next to it. It doesn't look anything like China. It looks probably more like Indonesia. And then a house full of little kids, which is, I have a huge heart for orphanages. And then a Bible, and then marriage, and then wedding rings on the top, and a happy face. So I'm looking at this during my week of prayer, of seeking God, and I cannot believe it. Because I'm like, well, obviously none of us knew. How did God know that before I got married, I would go to China? I always imagined those missionaries would go to China like 50, 60 years down the line when they're retired, that's when they go. But I was like, how did God know that right after I went to college, basically that's when I would be sent out? So I felt like I was looking at a map of my life. And I feel like for me personally, I saw that as only because God called me, and as I was seeking Him, that He answered and confirmed, this is the calling, this is the calling that placed upon you. And I think that's why moving to China was such a fearless, I'm a very fearful person by nature. It became a very fearless thing for me to do. People were like, are you afraid? There's pollution, blah, 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 cancer, all these things. And but I was actually, no, I'm super excited because in my heart, I knew that God had confirmed it. And so I was able to move forward with complete confidence that God had called me. So it's just something I just really want to encourage you guys in is, have you sought out for that calling in a place of desperation? And has God met you there? So that's, so this is a question. And so what we're going to do is this very similar pattern. I'm going to go through each of those steps. And what I'd like you guys to do is we're going to have more private kind of personal time where I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to give you like a minute or two just to jot down an answer and spend a little time asking God, what he has to say. And then we'll continue. At the very end, we'll have maybe some time for discussion. But I just want some time for you guys just to think and ask and listen to the Lord. So the question here is, what would the parting of your new Jordan involve? Ask for a faith-filled vision as you pray. Have you been moving ahead of God in any way? Ask him where he is moving. So I'm just going to give you guys like a minute or two. Yeah, just a minute or two. Jot down, ask God, and then we'll come back together. So just take some time doing that. Okay, we're going to come back together now. So the second step is consecrate. This is one of my favorite verses, actually in the entire Bible. So Joshua 3:5. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. And Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people. So they took it up and went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. So for me, the first thing that kind of really stands out in this verse is this whole idea of consecrate. Consecrate yourselves. And I like it because it's almost, I feel like it is something that God says to us today. Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things for you. And I like it because it's not about us doing things. It's first and foremost us having to check our hearts before God. Because I do often have seen that the strongholds within my own hearts is often the very thing that blocks God from doing the amazing things he wants to do. God can do whatever he wants. But it is so true that he desires first and foremost for us to be right with him. And I often see it as my own pride, my own sin, my own doubt. That is what is blocking God's movement in a space. And so this is just something I really wanted to kind of bring up. And because I think a very firm kind of takeaway from this is when we conform to the ways of the Spirit, his power is released. I'm going to say that one more time just to allow it to resonate a little bit more. When we conform to the ways of the Spirit, his power is released. And so you can imagine that when we're not able to see things and be able to experience things through God's eyes, there's so much limiting the floodgates of heaven from opening in us and then through us. And so I'm going to kind of just tell a little a story basically from when this is something that I personally had to learn in a very difficult way. I would call it probably a crucible of my own. Is when Matt and we started dating when I pretty much landed in China. About a year into our dating time, we both felt like we were not bringing each other closer to God. That there was a lack of holiness in our lives. We were crossing physical boundaries, and it was tearing me apart. And also at that time, we both weren't seeing God do much in our time in China. And so I remember that time was really difficult, but we ended up submitting to both ourselves as well as our leaders, and we told them we're thinking of taking some time apart. We're actually thinking of breaking up. And so we're like, okay, let's seek God's confirmation. So we actually spent some time seeking God's confirmation. And what was really interesting was that Sunday that we had to make that final decision of breaking up, we went to 2 different services, completely different denominations. One was like super Southern Baptist, the other was like charismatic. So really 2 different. And so we went, and I remember that we sat down and the pastor was saying, I'm preaching on Luke today, specifically about leaving everything and come follow me. He said, and our God he's like, I don't know if you've seen Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan. Aslan, he is not a safe God, but he's a good God. He doesn't always give you what you want, but you can trust him. And we're like, and we both of us were just like, felt like, okay, God is speaking to us, speaking to me individually about what we were thinking about. We go to the next service, the charismatic service. The pastor comes up and he says, today I'm preaching on Luke, specifically about Jesus saying, come follow me, and leave everything. And me and Mark, like, do they share sermon notes? Like, what is going on? And then in his message, he's like, and I just want to talk, Aslan? Aslan in Chronicles of Narnia? He's like, he's not a safe God, but he's a good God. And me and Maya are just like, sitting there like, what in the world? Like, they literally said the exact same message, and the message was so relevant to what we were going through at that moment, which was, you need to submit, you need to consecrate yourselves to me, and you need to let me, you need to give this up. And so actually at the time, we actually did end up, that night, we actually ended up having a very, very, very clear breakup. We emailed all our friends and said, we're no longer together. And I would say we took it became a 6-month hiatus, but it was within that 6 months that I actually saw the birth of the Women's Rise Foundation that I ended up starting, with women coming to faith, one after another, after another, after another, after another. And I will share that story a little bit later, but I really look back on that this time as that desire to consecrate ourselves, no matter how hard it was, to sacrifice whatever it took to be holy, in order for God to move, so that we would not be a barrier on the mission field. And that's something that I think is often mislooked over among leaders in the workplace. How important God's holiness is. It's far more important than any results that you could ever deliver. First and foremost is your heart right before the Lord. And so that's my next question. What in your life could be holding up the amazing things God is prepared to do for you? Ask God to show you steps that you must take in order for his power to be released. So I'm just gonna, actually, let me see. I actually would like you guys to share that with one person next to you. Just take, we have time. Take 5 minutes and just kind of share this, or if you want to share what you were thinking about prior, take 5 minutes, just share with one person next to you, and then I'll harness us all back together for the next step. But yeah, why don't you guys take a moment and share? Okay, we're gonna bring it back. You guys can all talk about it more, but I think at the end of the session. Okay, I'm gonna get started again. So now we're gonna move into the third stage, which is cross. And so we're in Joshua 3:11. So it says, "See the ark of the covenant of the Lord, all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap. Now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan." And so I think I just want to really paint this picture if you can't visualize it. So we have, I don't know, who here has seen the Jordan River? Okay, awesome. For those who have not been, they should really see it. Is it a small river?
Well, it's neither deep nor wide.
Yes, not today, but back then, it was it a rushing, like we're talking rushing, gushing, very, 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 very fast moving river. So it's not something where you're like, oh, it's like a nice little pond that I'm just gonna like tiptoe over. It is huge. Like we're talking absolutely huge. And it is something that when you're looking at it, it is insanely daunting. Of like looking at it, you wouldn't be like, oh, I can do that. It's more like, what? We have to cross the Jordan? Is really the question that would come up when looking at it. And one great exercise that I recommend to do more deep dive in, ask yourselves, because right before this, remember, they had just crossed the Red Sea, right? So Moses had just led them across the Red Sea. So they had seen this miracle before. And if you ever want to do more of an in-depth Bible study, I recommend asking the differences and the similarities between these two situations, both in the leader as well as the actual situations in itself. But we don't have as much time for that today, but I think two major things when we think about the crossing of the Red Sea and this Jordan. So remember, that generation for the most part that had crossed the Red Sea is not present anymore. The generation that we're talking about are the ones that have heard the stories of the crossing of the Red Sea but had not experienced it for themselves. Except for, Joshua was there, but a lot of the other generation had gone. And so they had heard about it, they had not seen it. Another really interesting point about this is that as with the Red Sea, Moses lifted the staff and it parted. But in this case, what you see is a little bit different in that he had to have 12 men actually physically step into the water for the seas to part, for the Jordan to part. So again, a very different scenario. There actually had to be a step of faith that had to happen, of stepping into the water before even seeing any miraculous work. So again, just kind of a different generation, different situation, and what I believe was preparation for them to go to Jericho. Right, when you think about it, this was right before they had to move to Jericho, and again, they would see those impregnable walls, and I think the hope is that they would remember that they had just crossed the Jordan, and that they had to take a step of faith, and through that see God miraculously show up. And so just a few things to call out. So one, what I love about this is the Ark of the Covenant, the Lord of all God will go ahead, will go into the Jordan ahead of you. I just love that statement, is that God goes ahead of us into our seasons of uncertainty. God goes ahead of us in the areas of doubt. And that's just such an encouraging thing to remember and to note as you guys are walking into places where there is unknown. And secondly, what I love here is, again, they had to set foot in the Jordan. And I think often, we're often like, we do talk about waiting upon the Lord and hoping that he does something. But I've found, at least in my own faith, often it's I have to first take a step in order, and then God kind of does the rest. But often it does require that step of faith to see things open. I think God does that to, I don't know, for me at least, it's a relational thing, that God allows me to first kind of take that first step to see that he's right there, that when I do take that step, he does show up. And I've seen that over and over again in my own personal walk. But I do love that once they set foot in the Jordan, they were standing firmly on dry ground. They found themselves standing firmly on dry ground after they stepped foot there. And what I love about this idea of standing firmly on dry ground is, I don't know if you know the hymn, a really famous hymn about on Christ the solid rock we stand, all other else is sinking sand. And I now having worked in some of the biggest Tier 1, Fortune 1 companies in the world, I can say over and over again, Christ is the only solid rock that we can stand on. Everything else that we see that the world has made pillars of really does fall away. And that's what's so encouraging in this verse, is that he is really that solid dry ground, that when you step foot in the Jordan in faith, you will find that God is right there. And so he who leads you into the Jordan will stay with you until you cross safely. He will never leave you nor forsake you, as we see as that step, that choice to cross. And I think the story here for me is, as I said, when I moved to China, there was an opportunity to invite some of the girls I met either at the massage parlors, in my office, to my house for dinner. And again, that time Matt and I were broken up. My sister, my little baby sister, had come visited me. She's a chef. So she actually was working at a very top 5 Michelin star, not 5 Michelin, I don't know anything about Michelin stars, some Michelin star restaurant in Shanghai. But at my house, she would cook these elaborate dinners. And so I would be able to invite some of my coworkers, my friends, all non-believers, to my house for dinner. And I first invited one. She's like, these dinners are great, can I invite a friend? And I was like, sure. She started bringing her friends, and I was like, how about we just read John together after dinner? And so we started with John 1, and it soon became a very thriving Bible study of its own, week in, week out. My sister had to go back to the States, so we started ordering in Chinese food. Unfortunately, that was a great hook and line. But that group expanded into what you see in this picture. So it grew into over 20, 30 women. All of them got saved within the first year. And I personally got to baptize 4 of them in a small pond with fish. And yeah, so I got to disciple them for my 4 years that I was in China, and it was an absolute blessing. And I again see it as, again, just that first step of inviting one, asking another. This group actually eventually grew to be, they started working with me to run conferences across China, specifically for women topics, on dealing with sex, dealing with family baggage, dealing with workplace pressures, topics that the local Chinese church doesn't really address. And the first meeting that we had over 120 women across 15 different house churches in Shanghai come. And we just the blessing, the flourishing that came from that was amazing. And again, I really attribute it to those steps of consecration, of crossing, of choosing to follow God. And again, it wasn't anything I could have planned, but it was God showing up in the places that we decided to cross and stand in. So that's just kind of a personal testimony of how God has shown up. So the question following this is, what steps of faith in your ministry or work is God calling you to take or lead your people into? What steps of faith in your ministry or work is God calling you to take or lead your people into? Are there areas of risk that God is inviting you into to experience Him? One thing that I feel like people are like, wow, you went to China to serve all these people. And I tell people, no, I went to China because God told me that going to China was for me. Like, He went there to actually show up, to show me who He is. And that's what it was about. And that's really what I came to experience when I moved there. So out of time's sake, I'm going to go through the last few and then just kind of open it up for you guys to kind of talk and share afterwards. The fourth step is celebrate. And so we see in Joshua 4, Joshua said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take a stone on his shoulder according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. So celebrate. They're supposed to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. And so this whole idea is, when God does something amazing in your life, how many people do you share it with? Do you have anything to commemorate? Is this something that you look back to, or is it something you just kind of move on from and say, okay, what's the next thing? The importance of these memorial stones, I cannot say how important it is, because whenever I face another trial of uncertainty, I can always look back on my memorial stones. Whether that be that paper towel that you just saw, whether that be some journal writing that I've written, or just some photographs that I have. Those have been a way for me to remember what God has done. And so be ready to mark the event and memorial to God's faithfulness. This will be your witness to others who need to see and believe. And I think that's, as leaders, that's a huge way to disciple, honestly. For me, at least, that's been a way I disciple. I share what God has done in my life. I share about these amazing memorial moments where God has shown up. And that, for me, has been an amazing way to encourage, as well as show people that this is how God can work in your life as well. So the question for following from this is, what are memorial stones from your first crossing remind you of what God has done for you and still can do in your life? And the story here for me is really when me and Matt got the call for Kellogg to go to business school. It was really strange because we ended up getting a call very similar into when we got our calls for Nike. So when we got our calls for Kellogg, we were separate. We were in two physical different places. Matt got a call first, and then I got a call separately. And I remember when I got the call, I was in the U.S., Matt was in Shanghai, and I said, the recruiter was like, I just want to congratulate you. And I was like, oh, thank you so much. And I was like, can you tell me if my husband got in? And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, unfortunately I can't tell you. But she's like, but I'll be making another call very soon, hint, hint. And I was like, oh, okay. And then that's how I knew that he had gotten in as well. We called each other, we celebrated. And with Nike, it was also very up in the air whether or not we would both get in. I remember we both got the call. We were in two physical different places. He got the call first. I got the call. I asked the recruiter again. I was like, I don't know, do you know anything about my husband? And she said the exact same phrase that I heard when I heard back from Kellogg. And for me, it just felt like God was confirming what I've done beforehand in both of your lives, I've done again. And so for me, that was just kind of a small way, but it was big for me, and how God was reminding me that He can do whatever He wants over and over again. And the final step is circle. And this is really based off of, I don't know if you've read the book, Mark Batterson's book, The Circle Maker, but this concept is based off of that. I highly recommend it if you have not read it. So Joshua 6, now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout, and the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, and everyone straight in. So the Jericho story is really famous. I think what for me, where I really want to, I think 2 points. One is, I think Jericho, there is a physical situation that they're in, but I think the Jerichos that we are in this day and age, are spiritual. There are spiritual strongholds that you cannot see in the offices, in the cities that you are in. And unless you are praying circles around it, 1, you will not see it, 2, you will not be able to break through. And you'll just continually hit walls and walls over and over again. You won't understand why, because you have not prayed around it. And one very, very good story that kind of ties completely to this is when I was working at Apple, I had this really strange, I woke up one day and I just felt like God was telling me this Jericho story. And he was like, walk around your office 7 times. And I was like, what? I was like, this has got to be a joke. I was like, I don't think God really meant that. And so I went to the office. But when I walked in, I just really, again, felt the Holy Spirit was like, walk around the office 7 times. And I was like, okay. And so I remember, and what's interesting is our Apple office is actually a square. So we were in a high rise, you could actually walk all the way through. And all the different buildings or all the other desks are right around it. So I started walking and started praying through the office. And at that point, we had not yet had a Bible study, we had not had a prayer group, nothing. So it was just me walking in circles. And so it got pretty awkward because, I mean, the first time is fine because, you could have just went to go talk to a coworker. Second time, there's like one of the people shouted like, oh, are you exercising? And I'm like, kind of, and I kept walking. By the 4th time, I mean, I was just like getting like red cheeked. But this girl actually came and started, she's like, oh, are you actually? She's like, oh, I've always wanted to exercise. Like, around the office, great idea. Can I walk with you? And I was like, sure. And so we started walking together. I'm like silently praying as we're walking and talking. And she starts asking me, she's like, so, she's like, what do you do on the weekends? And I was like, oh, I go to this church here. And then she's like, can I come with you? And I was like, yeah, sure. She's like, cool. She's like, okay, I'm done now. I'm gonna sit. And I'm like, okay, cool. And she like sits down. She's like, oh, that was a good exercise. And she sat. And then I'm on my 5th round. And then on my 5th round, at the end of the 5th round, another guy comes over. He's like, I haven't seen you for a while. How have you been doing? And I'm like, I'm doing really well. He's like, you just exercising? And I was like, no, I'm praying. And then he's like, cool, I'm a believer as well. And I was like, what? I didn't know that. And then we just kind of started chatting as well. And then 6th, and then at the very 7th was the secretary came over. She's like, I think it's great what you're doing. And I ended up inviting her to my Bible study, that women's Bible study, which she actually ended up coming that night. And so I tell that story, and actually soon after I ended up meeting the CMO of that department, who was also a believer, and we ended up starting a prayer group at Apple, which exists to this day. We saw several salvations come from it. But what I want to say about that more so is there are so many strongholds. I had no idea at Apple like what kind of strongholds were there. As I was walking through and praying, I did sense that there was just a lot of like this spirit of siloedness in the office, and because of that, people weren't able to really kind of come and interact and get to know each other, right? And I do believe that as I was physically walking around the office in prayer, things were being broken that I could not see, and that God Himself was showing up and letting the walls of Jericho fall in that way. And I do encourage you, if you have not done a prayer walk around your office, like, it doesn't hurt. The worst that could happen to you is people could look at you strange and think that you're exercising. But the best thing is God could, show up in some really unique ways that you had never thought possible. And so that's just one thing I really wanted to bring up with everyone. So, yeah, what are the spaces God wants you to spiritually, physically circle and claim as His own that potentially currently Satan may have dominion over, that we don't even see it because we're not asking? And so that's just something I want to encourage you guys is to think and ask what those are. And so just to recap, again, these 5 steps that we see in Joshua. 1, to be called, to wait, to consecrate yourselves before the Lord, to cross the Jordan, to circle, and to celebrate all that God has done. And so I think to close, I'm just going to have a time of prayer. So I'm actually going to invite a worship. So we could just have a little time of worship in the background. But I just want you guys to, as we kind of ask those questions, I mean, some of them are pretty serious, like deep questions. I just want to open us up in just a very short amount of time of prayer before God, where we can kind of ask, listen, and pray for our spaces that we're in. Prayer coverage is by far the best thing you can do, beyond physically doing anything and talking and sharing with people. Prayer coverage, prayer for those around you, prayer for people that God has placed in your life. So I just want to do that now. So I'll lead us in a time of prayer. So let's just, I'm gonna open us in a time of prayer, and then after that I'll close us.